Tension filled the boardroom as every eye fixed on the projection screen. Morgan Chase leaned toward the employee sitting beside her, whispering sharply in his ear, "Peek one more time, and you're fired." The man, a single father newly hired as an assistant, simply smirked in response. The entire room held its breath, expecting him to stammer apologies or show embarrassment. Instead, he replied calmly, "I'm visually impaired. Trust me." The boardroom fell completely silent, a single sentence that would open a story no one could have imagined. Daniel Foster's fingers moved with practiced precision across his Braille keyboard, the subtle clicks barely audible over the hushed voices of executives discussing quarterly projections. 3 years after the construction accident that had stolen most of his sight, he'd rebuilt his life around what remained his 9-year-old daughter Emma, his determination to provide for her and his absolute refusal to be defined by limitations others placed on him. The leather portfolio resting beside his specialized tablet contained the tools of his new reality, adaptive technology that transformed his disability into a different form of ability. The job at Apex Technologies had been nearly impossible to secure. 23 interviews over 8 months, each ending with variations of the same polite rejection. "We're concerned about workplace safety. We're not sure our systems are compatible with your needs." What they meant was simpler. They saw his white cane and assumed incompetence. His mind drifted briefly to Emma, imagining her in school at this moment, probably answering questions with the same confident directness that often startled adults. She'd grown up too fast after Catherine's death and then his accident 6 months later. At 9, she possessed an emotional intelligence that sometimes made Daniel forget she was still a child. Just last night, she'd placed her small hand on his cheek while he helped with her math homework. "Dad, your eyes can't see, but your heart sees more than other people's." The thought warmed him, steadying his nerves as he navigated this new corporate environment where he was the only visually impaired employee among hundreds. Each workstation, hallway, and meeting room had been carefully memorized during his orientation, counting steps and noting landmarks that would help him maintain independence. He'd arrived 30 minutes early this morning to set up his equipment, the same efficiency he'd developed during his engineering days, now applied to the more mundane role of administrative assistant. Morgan Chase entered the boardroom like a force of nature, her crisp footsteps announcing her presence before she spoke. At 30, she commanded Apex Technologies with the kind of decisive leadership that had doubled the company's valuation in 3 years. Daniel recognized her voice from his brief interview, intelligent, impatient, and utterly without tolerance for inefficiency. The business magazines called her a visionary. Former employees on job review sites used less flattering terms. The meeting began with quarterly projections and market analysis. Daniel's fingers flew across his keyboard, taking detailed notes, while his audio software whispered stock prices and data points through his discreet earpiece. Years of practice had made him faster and more accurate than most traditional note-takers. The specialized system he'd developed with Emma's help allowed him to organize information in real time, creating searchable databases rather than simple transcripts. He was completely absorbed in his work when he sensed movement beside him. Morgan had leaned closer, apparently observing his note-taking process with suspicion. Her expensive perfume, something floral with subtle notes of sandalwood, reached him a moment before her whispered accusation. "Peek one more time and you're fired." The words were delivered with ice-cold authority, clearly intended to embarrass him in front of the executive team. Daniel felt every conversation in the room halt as colleagues turned to witness his humiliation. He'd encountered this assumption countless times, that his occasional head movements or the way his hands moved across his equipment indicated he was faking or exaggerating his disability. For a moment, he considered explaining it his adaptive technology, describing how his equipment worked, or detailing the accident that had changed his life. Instead, he did something that surprised even himself. He smiled. The expression was genuine, tinged with the kind of quiet confidence that came from facing far greater challenges than an intimidating CEO. He lifted his head toward Morgan's voice with the calm assurance of someone who had nothing to prove to people who couldn't see beyond their own assumptions. "I'm visually impaired," he said simply, his voice carrying clearly across the silent boardroom. "Trust me." The 2 words hung in the air like a challenge. Daniel heard Morgan's sharp intake of breath, felt the collective tension of 20 executives who suddenly realized they'd witnessed something unexpected. He'd just done what no one ever did to Morgan Chase, called her bluff with unshakable composure. Daniel returned to his note-taking as if nothing had happened, his fingers resuming their practiced dance across the keyboard. But something had shifted in the room's atmosphere. The whispered conversations didn't resume immediately, and he could feel eyes watching him with new curiosity rather than dismissive judgment. For the first time since his accident, Daniel wondered if he'd found a place where his abilities might matter more than his limitations. The meeting continued for another 40 minutes, executives discussing product launches and market strategies, while Daniel documented every word. When the room finally cleared, Morgan's voice stopped him as he reached for his white cane. "Mr. Foster, a word, please." Her tone had shifted from sharp accusation to something more controlled, though equally intense. Daniel had expected this. The direct confrontation, the demand for explanations, possibly even termination despite his first-day status. He'd been fired before for making employers uncomfortable, for challenging their assumptions about disability and capability. "Of course, Ms. Chase," he replied, settling back into his chair with the calm confidence that had carried him through 3 years of rebuilding his life. Morgan waited until they were alone before speaking. "I owe you an apology." The words weren't what Daniel had expected. In his experience, powerful people rarely acknowledge mistakes, especially to subordinates they just publicly humiliated. "Your assumption was understandable. Many people aren't familiar with adaptive workplace technology." Daniel kept his tone neutral, professional, rather than accusatory. "That's generous, but we both know I was out of line. Your personnel file mentioned visual impairment, but I hadn't taken time to understand what that meant practically." Morgan's voice carried a note of professional acknowledgement rather than personal warmth, but Daniel heard genuine regret beneath the formal tone. Most people don't. They hear visually impaired and assume either complete darkness or complete fabrication. The reality is usually more complicated. "Explain it to me." The request was direct, businesslike, but Daniel sensed genuine curiosity rather than administrative obligation. "I have approximately 15% vision remaining in my left eye, enough to distinguish light and shadow, some basic shapes and movement. My right eye was damaged beyond repair in the accident." "Construction accident?" Morgan was clearly referencing his file. 3 years ago. "Concrete beam failure during a system inspection. I was an IT engineer specializing in safety systems for construction firms. The irony doesn't escape me." Daniel's tone remained matter-of-fact, the way he'd learned to discuss the accident with Emma when she asked questions. "The safety equipment prevented fatal injuries, but debris damaged my optic nerves." "You have a daughter, Emma, 9 years old. She's been my motivation for learning these new systems. Hard to help with homework when you can't see traditional text, so I mastered audio to text conversion and braille displays pretty quickly." Daniel smiled slightly, thinking of Emma's patient attempts to describe her art projects or explain math problems they worked through together. "She's become quite the teacher herself." "That must be challenging." "Everything's challenging at first," Daniel replied. "But people adapt. Emma learned to describe things more vividly. I learned to listen more carefully, and we found new ways to connect. Sometimes limitations force you to discover capabilities you didn't know you had." The observation seemed to resonate with Morgan. Though Daniel couldn't see her expression to confirm his impression, he heard her shift in her chair, the soft rustle of fabric suggesting she was leaning forward with interest rather than preparing to dismiss him. "Your note-taking today was remarkably thorough," she said, "more detailed than most assistants manage. Audio processing and voice-to-text conversion allows me to capture verbatim transcripts while simultaneously organizing key points by topic." Daniel explained, "I can have formatted meeting minutes ready for distribution within 20 minutes of adjournment, complete with action items and follow-up assignments." "Show me." Daniel opened his tablet, navigating through practice finger movements across the screen. His voice control software responded to quiet commands, pulling up the meeting transcript and displaying it in large text that Morgan could read, while audio software provided him with the same information through his earpiece. "This is comprehensive," Morgan said, scanning the document. "You've organized statements by speaker, categorized decisions by department, and flagged items requiring follow-up. Most assistants take days to produce minutes, this detailed. Efficiency was essential in my previous career. When you're managing information systems with multiple safety protocols, accurate documentation prevents costly mistakes." Daniel minimized the application and turned toward Morgan's voice. I apply the same principles to administrative work. Morgan's phone buzzed against the conference table, but surprisingly, she ignored it. In Daniel's experience, powerful executives never ignored calls during conversations with subordinates. Her continued attention felt significant. "Why administrative work?" she asked. "With your technical background, there must be IT positions better suited to your qualifications." The question touched on territory Daniel usually avoided discussing with employers. But something in Morgan's tone suggested genuine interest rather than invasive curiosity. Construction sites aren't particularly accommodating to visual impairments. Safety regulations and insurance liability made returning to fieldwork impractical. Office-based IT positions required visual interface with multiple monitors and complex graphics that my adaptive technology couldn't fully access at the time. "So you chose administrative work." "I chose work that would allow me to support my daughter while utilizing skills I could still perform effectively," Daniel corrected gently. "Administrative work isn't a consolation prize. It's a strategic choice that matches my current capabilities with meaningful contribution." The phone buzzed again more insistently. This time Morgan glanced at it with obvious reluctance. "I need to take this," she said. "But Mr. Foster, Daniel, I want to continue this conversation. Would you be available for lunch later this week? I'd like to better understand how to optimize your role here and ensure you have the resources needed for success." The invitation surprised Daniel. Business lunches weren't typically extended to first-day administrative assistants, especially after public confrontations about their capabilities. "Of course," he replied. "I appreciate the opportunity." "Good. Thursday, 12:30. Rossetti's on 5th. And Daniel, your work today was exemplary. I look forward to seeing what other assumptions you might challenge." As her footsteps receded